Let's look inside a Manhattan boardroom where $100 million partnership is about to go down. Claire Whitmore stared across the table, immediately dismissing the man in the faded gray suit. Then she coldly pulled her hand back. Her board watched in silence as the arrogant CEO refused to shake hands with Oliver Hayes. A devoted single father she dismissed as nothing more than a low-level, struggling businessman. Nobody spoke. 14 days later, $200 million vanished. Her clients fled and her empire began crumbling. Who was this quiet giant, really? The Monday morning light over Brooklyn was dim and gray when Oliver Hayes finished up his quiet coffee at the counter of a modest brownstone that blended right into the quiet block. The suit hanging by his door was charcoal, 3 years old. It had a slight fray near the cuff he never cared to mend. He put it on calmly. Like any normal worker dressing without fanfare, he simply stepped out into the cold air of Atlantic Avenue. He drove a 5-year-old sedan. His worn leather briefcase had been patched up twice. None of the neighbors waving to him at the corner, Delay realized this quiet man. Buying his black coffee and a folded Times actually controlled one of the quietest, most powerful financial empires in the country. And Oliver preferred it that way. He built his firm over 20 years on one golden rule, a lesson in humility for everyone around him. Never let a status symbol speak before the actual person does. On this morning, he was driving to a massive meeting that Wall Street deemed incredibly important. A tech company called Whitmore Dynamics was bleeding cash trying to launch a huge national rollout. And his quiet investment fund had stepped in as their absolute last hope. The rescue check was $200 million. The executive boardroom upstairs had been preparing for this day for weeks. Yet the only person who failed to grasp the weight of this moment was the proud woman sitting at the head of the table inside her glass tower, high above Park Avenue. Claire Whitmore was already 3 hours deep into her day. Her office was built entirely to be photographed by the glossy magazines that praised her sharp shoulders and loved her incredibly aggressive opinions. She had run her company for 9 years. Surrounded by yes-men whose constant shallow praise, she fully believed made her the fiercest operator in the tech world. She had completely believed her own hype. Her nervous assistant quietly placed the morning brief on the desk, stepping back with the silence of a dismissed servant. Claire casually glanced at the pages, showing the dismissive speed of a leader who stopped caring about details long ago. The massive investor was listed simply as Hayes Global Capital. The representative was listed simply as Sabazo Hayes. Claire didn't waste a second on it. She rarely wasted time on anyone she deemed beneath her high executive status. The only thing she respected was the size of the money. $200 million would easily secure her entire rollout. This deal would buy her 5 more years atop the industry lists that fed her massive ego. Her board had been restless for 2 whole quarters. With the stock drifting, failing to close this deal would ruin her reputation. She knew it would give her rivals on the board the exact excuse they needed to oust her. Her assistant, Patricia, hovered nervously near the doorway. "Mr. Hayes is already in the building, ma'am. He arrived early." Claire did not even look up. "Send him up once the others are seated. I do not want him talking to anyone before I am in the room." Oliver walked into the grand lobby of Whitmore Dynamics 12 minutes before his scheduled meeting. The security guards barely deigned to look at him. The receptionist behind the cold marble counter took his name and scanned her list. She looked up, silently judging whether this plainly dressed man could possibly be the high-level guest on her list. His lack of flashy status symbols clearly confused her. With a polite but condescending tone, she asked if he was sure he had the right address. He simply told her yes. She typed on her keyboard, frowned at her monitor, then waved over an assistant from the desk. The two whispered while Oliver waited patiently, completely unfazed by their shallow judgments of his worn briefcase. An executive in a $1,000 coat brushed past him toward the elevators, offering him the exact kind of sneering look reserved for unimportant people who had clearly wandered into the wrong building. Finally, the assistant returned with a security badge and a look that showed she felt superior. Someone on the top floor had agreed to see him purely out of pity. Escorting him to the elevator felt less like a warm courtesy and more like security supervision. Oliver thanked her, using her name. She blinked, surprised that a visitor had bothered to read her name tag. Riding up alone, he calmly watched the digital floor numbers steadily climb. He had been in 100 corporate offices just like this. He knew that the grand height of a skyscraper rarely reflected the character of the people working inside it. He adjusted his coat, waiting for the doors to slide open on the 30th floor. The boardroom was specifically designed to intimidate anyone who entered. A massive, dark conference table dominated nearly the entire length of the room. Around it sat 12 executives. Each of them wore high-end designer suits, using expensive labels to broadcast their self-important status to the world. Daniel Carver, the veteran of this elite group, sat watching the door with cold, calculating eyes. He possessed the smug patience of someone who had survived decades of corporate backstabbing. Claire made her grand entrance last, taking the head of the table without offering a single greeting. The room fell completely silent, bowing to her absolute authority. Her assistant stood quietly by the side door, ready for the high-stakes drama to unfold. She was prepared to fetch documents or relay orders instantly. Then Oliver Hayes stepped calmly into the room. The change in the room was subtle but undeniable. Arrogant eyes instantly scanned his worn sleeves and unpolished leather bag, judging him instantly. Yet his face remained entirely unreadable. Two younger board members shared a mocking smirk. At the end of the table, a man quietly smirked. Claire did not even try to hide her arrogant judgment. She looked him up and down like cheap office furniture, reserving her respect only for high status. Oliver walked to the empty chair directly across from her and set his briefcase down. He calmly reached across the table to shake hands. It was a standard show of professional respect, the kind that should never depend on a person's title. Claire stared at his hand, then looked up, letting her ego guide her. She kept her own hand flat on the table, refusing his basic courtesy. "I think there has been a mistake," she said. She spoke loudly on purpose, ensuring the entire room witnessed her arrogant dismissal. "I was told the lead investor was sending someone senior. I was not expecting a courier." A nervous, awkward laugh echoed from somewhere near the back. The laugh died instantly, yet Oliver kept his hand extended, showing true dignity. He held it out, giving her room to correct herself. Long enough for every single person in that room to notice she had snubbed his respectful gesture. Finally, he pulled his hand back. "Oliver Hayes," he introduced himself calmly. "Hayes Global Capital, I am here for the 11 a.m. Claire smirked, completely unaware of the massive opportunity she was about to lose. "Hayes Global Capital, right, forgive me, Mr. Hayes, but I run an enterprise that closes massive deals. We do not waste time with small firms that have not earned a seat at my table." Patricia watched silently from the door. She stared at the floor. Daniel Carver leaned back slowly in his seat. He was a cautious man who knew when someone's blind pride was about to destroy an opportunity they could not afford to lose. Oliver did not react right away. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with total composure. His slow, deliberate movements showed he was completely unbothered by her attitude. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single folder. He set it closed on the table, letting her sit in her own arrogance. "I came here," he said, "because I was told this meeting was crucial for your business. I assumed basic respect was standard practice, regardless of status." Her eyes narrowed sharply. She hated being corrected, especially by a man she judged purely on his appearance. "Mr. Hayes," she sneered, "let me make this plain, since you clearly do not understand your place in this room. Whitmore Dynamics is a publicly traded company valued at over $6 billion. We are way out of the league of whatever tiny firm you are running out of some basement. I am sure your clients are thrilled to just be near actual wealth. But I do not have time for your little games." A tense, heavy silence settled over the room. People squirmed uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her cruelty. Daniel looked as if he might intervene, but he kept his mouth shut. Beside her, the chief financial officer watched this prideful train wreck unfold. She kept her eyes locked on the leather folder, as if staring at it could rescue her from her own arrogant mistake. Oliver remained completely silent for several heavy seconds. He studied the prideful CEO across the wide black table. He looked at the 12 faces around her, all of them avoiding his gaze. Then he closed the folder he never even opened and slipped it back into his briefcase. "I see," he said quietly, then stood up. He calmly buttoned the single button of his suit jacket. "Thank you for your time," that was all he offered her. He did not raise his voice, nor did he defend himself. He did not mention his massive firm, its scale, or the $1 million funding he had prepared to commit. He simply turned and walked past the entire table without looking at anyone, and walked right out the door he had entered through. Patricia silently stepped aside as the billionaire investor passed. The silent boardroom remained frozen long after the door shut. Claire let out a short, arrogant breath that was almost a laugh. "Well," she said, looking around at her silent team. That was easier than expected, but Daniel did not laugh. He stared down at his legal pad, knowing she had just lost their greatest opportunity. Out in the hallway, Oliver walked calmly toward the executive elevator. Patricia quickly caught up with him halfway. She was an assistant who had learned over the years that respect should never be reserved just for status and titles. She offered to accompany him downstairs, but he insisted it was not necessary. She walked with him anyway, keeping a respectful distance behind him. Once they reached the elevator, she finally found her voice. "Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry." He looked at her with the same quiet dignity he carried in the boardroom. "You do not owe me an apology." "She is not always," Patricia cut herself off. She wanted to defend her boss out of habit, but realized how hollow it would sound. "Have a good day, sir." Then the elevator chimed. Oliver stepped inside alone, the doors slid shut. The mirrored panel reflected the calm face of the powerful partner whom Claire's blind arrogance had just publicly rejected. He studied his reflection for a moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and took out his phone. He speed-dialed the second name on his contact list. Marcus Reed, the chief financial officer of Hayes Global Capital. He picked up on the very first ring, just like he always did for Oliver. He had been with the investment firm for 16 years. Before a single word was spoken, he knew that a massive turn of events would clear his afternoon. "Marcus," Oliver said, his voice holding the exact same calm as it did in the boardroom. It was quiet, deliberate, with absolutely no anger behind it. "Pull our funding from the Whitmore investment round." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end. Marcus knew the massive difference between Oliver Hayes asking a polite question and giving an absolute costly command. "Pull everything, every single penny of the 200 million. That collapses the secondary investors. They were waiting on us. I get it, they are going to demand explanations. Tell them whatever you want, just say we walked away." Oliver watched the elevator numbers drop toward the ground floor, and Marcus quietly buy up shares in their main competitor, the Pierce Group based in Boston. "I will call with details soon." Marcus never asked why. He had learned to trust Oliver years ago. "Got it. I will start processing the withdrawal right now." "Thank you." Oliver hung up and slipped the phone into his pocket. The elevator reached the lobby, opening onto the same expensive marble floor, the very floor where staff had judged him unworthy just an hour ago. He crossed the room calmly, handed back his visitor pass, and walked out into the chilly Park Avenue air. 30 floors above him. The arrogant leadership at Whitmore Dynamics had already moved on. Claire opened her launch plan and began laying out her demands, completely unaware of the disaster she just triggered. Elaine Marsh spoke up very cautiously. She questioned the schedule if Oliver's crucial investment fell through. Claire waved it off dismissively. "He will crawl back," she scoffed, convinced her status gave her total control. "A man like that does not get 2 chances to sit with us." Daniel Carver quietly jotted a note on his pad. He wrote the words slowly, underlining them as the gravity of her mistake sank in. He kept his thoughts hidden from the rest of the board. He would replay those few minutes over and over in his mind for days, trying to comprehend the massive self-sabotage he had just watched unfold. Patricia walked back to her desk outside the executive suite. She sat down, nervously straightening the items on her desk. She needed to look busy so no one would notice. Her hands were shaking from shock. Then she opened her computer and began typing the meeting notes, recording the disaster, weighing every syllable, knowing that someday investigators would want to read this record of pure arrogance. They would want to know who let pride destroy this entire company. Down on the street, Oliver got into his car and started the engine. He paused for a second, gripping the steering wheel in silence. His face showed no triumph, nor did it show any resentment. There was only the quiet, unshakable resolve of a man who would never look back. He merged into traffic, leaving Manhattan behind as he headed toward Brooklyn. Behind him, 30 floors up in that executive tower. A silent countdown had begun, though Claire was too proud to hear it. Her downfall started the exact second she refused to shake his hand. The ticking would not stop until her entire empire lay in ruins. You and I know that silence is often just the calm before the storm, but Claire took it as victory. She spent Tuesday hiding behind corporate meetings. Wednesday was spent performing for a pre-scheduled media appearance. She wore pristine navy, flashing her rehearsed empty smile. She smugly told the reporters that the upcoming investment was already a done deal, and they hung on every word. But by Thursday morning, the bank finalizing the deal called with devastating news. Marcus Reed had officially pulled the plug. The cancellation was signed hours after she dismissed Oliver. Within days, the withdrawal moved swiftly through the corporate hierarchy. Her biggest financial savior had completely backed out of the deal. $200 million vanished with one routine line of text. Elaine Marsh stared at the notice twice before slowly standing up. She marched straight to the boss's office without knocking. The secretary tried to block her at the entrance. Elaine simply raised the printed paper and spoke a single word. Patricia stepped away, leaving the arrogant CEO to read in silence. Claire did not scream, nor did she throw a tantrum. Instead, she set the page down and quietly smoothed the paper. Then she ordered Elaine to fetch the list of every co-investor backing the Hayes position. But Elaine was already holding it in her other hand. By sunset, Claire had dialed 9 of them herself, but 7 ignored her call. The 2 who did answer were polite but brief, essentially saying the exact same thing. Without the backing of Hayes, this investment was no longer worth their time. They offered brief apologies and hung up before she could even pitch them. Let's watch as Claire stands alone at her window, staring out over her dissolving empire. She still could not comprehend her own downfall. But her years of power told her this was a deliberate execution. Massive deals do not just fall apart like this, unless a truly powerful player wanted to crush her. The other investors were not scared away. They were ordered to leave. Desperate for answers, she demanded her assistant find out who this Oliver Hayes actually was, by any means. Her assistant was already on the case. In fact, she had been digging since Tuesday afternoon. The dossier placed on her desk was incredibly thin, which was a dangerous sign in itself. This massive firm did not advertise and had no public-facing partners. They did not brag in the glossy business magazines she worshipped. But deep in a securities filing lay the truth. They controlled over $41 billion in assets. To a massive fund like that, investing in her deal was a mere rounding error. His initial willingness to fund her was nothing more than a polite gesture. She stared at the enormous figure 3 times. Then she slowly collapsed back into her expensive chair. It is how we sit when pride finally crumbles and reality hits us. Her assistant hovered near the door, ready to help but too afraid to be the first one to leave the room. "Why did nobody warn me about him?" she finally whispered. It was not an actual question, just the sound of pure, helpless regret. Yet her assistant felt obligated to answer the broken CEO. "He keeps his name out of everything, ma'am. They operate through layers of anonymous companies. Almost nobody in our industry has ever even seen his face. The files called him O. Hayes because he values privacy over empty status and titles." Claire stared at the page in disbelief. She remembered Monday's disastrous board meeting. She thought of the hand she refused to shake. She remembered her dismissive words in front of 11 people whose memories she could no longer control. Every drop of color drained from her face. Like water slowly leaking from a cracked glass, her composure completely shattered in an instant. That weekend, we saw the narrative begin to shift. A minor business blog broke the story first. The headline was surprisingly cautious. It detailed the sudden collapse of Whitmore's crucial funding round, quietly burying a key detail in the 3rd paragraph. Their lead investor had backed out right after visiting the corporate headquarters. The journalist had no official comments from Hayes Capital. He did not need them. The devastating rumor went viral within 24 hours. By Monday morning, the company's stock crashed 9% at opening. By Wednesday, the shares plunged another 7%. Two of their biggest corporate clients made unexpected calls directly to Claire's office, speaking in the polite, tense tone of partners ready to jump ship, asking if their contracts were still secure. She assured them they were, though she knew they doubted her. Meanwhile, a rival CEO in Boston announced that his firm secured a massive new investment from a major partner, accelerating their own national expansion. He never named the backer, he did not have to. Anyone in the industry who understood basic business figured out exactly what had happened within minutes. The $200 million that walked out of her boardroom was not going to sit idle. It went straight into the hands of her fiercest competitor. That very morning, Hayes Capital released a brief, devastating public statement. It was their first public announcement in over 3 years. The note mentioned no names or financial details. It simply stated that the fund had reallocated its massive capital and would only invest in partners whose ethical values truly aligned with theirs. The very last sentence, the one that would go viral for weeks, cut deep. Read simply, "We do not partner with organizations that fail to respect people." The media understood that brutal lesson long before Claire did. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 separate journalists had bombarded her PR team, asking if she had any response to the statement. By Thursday, reporters had pieced together what happened on that 30th floor. By Friday, the public shaming had a specific target: her and inside her company. The atmosphere shifted instantly, as it always does when employees smell blood at the top. The junior executives who witnessed her display of arrogance now completely avoided her gaze in the hallway. Even her top board members, who previously stayed quiet during the disaster, were now speaking up far more than they ever did, demanding real answers about their collapsing finances and burn rate. Daniel Carver quietly called an emergency meeting with 2 other board members. Patricia sat behind her desk silently taking notes. Claire attacked the only way her arrogant ego knew how, by unleashing her high-priced law firm. She demanded they find some legal slip-up in the Hayes withdrawal to save her face. Any tiny mistake, any thread she could pull to publicly humiliate them. The top-tier lawyer took her call, listened calmly, and then spoke in. That careful, clinical voice used when delivering a hard, expensive reality check. The entire withdrawal process was perfectly legal and fully within the rules. No legal errors existed, no rules were broken. Just a clean exit. But her pride refused to yield. She ordered him to dig anyway. He charged her $200,000 over 10 days just to confirm his first warning. Let's remember, pride blinds us, and while she chased ghosts, the media found her real weakness. A journalist at a major business magazine. Following a tip, she started contacting ex-employees of Whitmore Dynamics. The first 3 people ignored her calls completely. But the 4th contact, Thomas Bryant, a former employee who left 18 months ago under a strict exit deal, called back immediately. They met quietly at a coffee shop just blocks from Grand Central. He talked for 90 minutes. He detailed the painful meetings where Claire constantly degraded anyone without an executive title. How she once sneered at a manager, claiming his cheap suit explained exactly why his entire department was failing. He described another victim, an outside consultant, whom Claire fired in front of 15 colleagues just for making a simple slide typo. He shared how a valuable business partnership was destroyed simply because the vendor's founder visually offended her, with Claire saying he did not look like he belonged in their lobby. The journalist asked if other former staffers would step forward to speak. Thomas quietly shared 4 names. When reached, 3 of them eagerly agreed to speak on the record. The last person declined but secretly passed along 3 highly damaging audio files. Secret internal recordings. Featuring Claire's unmistakable voice, saying cruel things that would instantly destroy her career once leaked. Her immense arrogance left her completely blind to the boardroom coup. Daniel Carver, operating from a lower floor she had always chosen to ignore, spent the entire week building a powerful coalition. He secured private support from 7 of the 11 board directors. He carefully studied the rules for calling an emergency session. He had not chosen a date yet. He was waiting for the perfect moment to trap her in an unavoidable meeting. The first damning audio file leaked online on Monday morning of the next week. Exactly 2 weeks since she had dismissed everyone in that boardroom. Claire was riding in her town car when her panicked PR head called with emergency news. She listened to 30 seconds of her own toxic words over the speaker. She instantly ordered her driver to turn back. Back at her desk, she forced herself to play all 3 files. The first was horrifying, the second was far worse. The third recording exposed her in a smaller room, refusing to shake Oliver Hayes's hand because she deemed him unworthy of her respect. She was caught telling a junior associate to quit the industry if he could not afford a more expensive suit. She sat frozen in her executive chair long after the final audio file ended. Her assistant Patricia stood quietly at the door, waiting to be dismissed. But Claire did not dismiss her. She could not say anything at all. By the next morning, her valuable clients began leaving in droves. A major retail account that had partnered with the firm for 11 years sent a termination letter before the day ended. A key logistics partner transferred its contract to a rival the next day. And that competitor in 3 out of 4 cases was the Boston firm Jonathan Pierce now ran. The $200 million Oliver moved was not just a check. It was a warning signal, and the market read it clearly. Inside the firm, we see a different kind of exodus starting. 2 senior vice presidents resigned within 48 hours, citing personal reasons that nobody believed. Their head of corporate communications resigned on Thursday and joined a competitor by Monday morning. Yet Patricia still came to work, quietly bringing Claire her morning binder. She continued typing meeting notes that grew shorter every day because the meetings themselves were shrinking. Claire stopped sleeping well. She hid her mounting panic from any camera that might catch it. She still wore professional navy and wore a practiced, superficial smile when required. But that artificial smile no longer fooled anyone, and the colleagues who knew her well had stopped pretending not to notice her decline. Daniel Carver, who had barely written a single line on his pad 2 weeks earlier, was now taking endless serious notes. Rebecca Stone, a board director who had witnessed Claire's arrogance that fateful morning, quietly requested a call with the firm's general counsel. She asked very specific questions about how to replace a sitting chief executive. The general counsel answered carefully. Rebecca thanked him and hung up, not needing to write a single word down. She possessed too much experience not to know which way the wind was already blowing. A reporter from the same national outlet that broke the audio story called Claire's office directly on the second Wednesday morning. He had 3 questions. First, about the disastrous meeting with Oliver Hayes. Second, about the 3 leaked audio files. And third, whether the board still trusted her arrogant leadership. And as you can probably guess, that final question told her exactly how much of the narrative had already slipped completely out of her control. She refused to offer any comment. Instead, she ordered Patricia to block all press inquiries for the rest of the day. Then she paced her silent office twice before stopping at the massive window. Below, the city looked exactly as it had on the morning of that fateful meeting. It did not care that her world was crumbling, it never did. For the first time in 2 weeks, she truly thought about the man across the table. She realized how cleanly he had undone her. He calmly buttoned his jacket before walking out. She kept picturing his calm, unbothered expression as he stood up. She mistook his quiet dignity for defeat. But she finally realized it was never defeat. It was the look of a man who had already decided her fate before he stood. The boardroom was just catching up. She also thought briefly of Patricia. About Daniel Carver quietly writing his single line. About Elaine Marsh, who had not even opened her folder. And that mocking laugh from the end of the table that had died too quickly. She realized too late that 11 witnesses had watched her mistake and not. One of them had stepped forward to defend her since that day. Their silence, more than the lost money, was the harsh truth she was still too afraid to face. On the morning of the 14th day after their fateful meeting, the company's stock plummeted another 12% on the news that a 4th major client had canceled their contract. The entire market value of Whitmore Dynamics, which stood at over $6 billion on the morning she refused that handshake, had now crashed below $3 billion. Daniel Carver made a quiet call from his office directly to the board's audit committee chair. The phone call lasted 40 minutes. By the end, the chair agreed to call an emergency meeting for that very afternoon. The encrypted notice went out to all 11 sitting board directors at 11:30 that morning. Set for 2 o'clock, they would meet in the exact same boardroom on the 30th floor. The agenda held just one item, a vote of confidence in their arrogant chief executive officer. As part of her job, Patricia received a copy of that notice. She read it once. She read it again. Then she silently entered Claire's office and placed the printout on the wooden desk. Claire stared down at the paper. The two women quietly locked eyes across the desk. Whatever warning Patricia wanted to give in the hallway when Oliver left 2 weeks ago, she stayed silent now. There was no need. The paper on the desk said everything. Claire slowly stood up. She crossed the room to the closet near her desk. She reached for the navy jacket she had planned to wear to a client dinner tonight. She slipped it on slowly, first one arm and then the other, moving with the heavy knowledge that she would not have another chance to change clothes for hours. She buttoned it. She smoothed the lapel. At 1:58, she walked out of her office and down the long hall to the boardroom. Patricia did not follow. Inside, the board members sat in the exact same chairs they occupied the morning they judged Oliver Hayes. The man whose hand she deemed unworthy to shake was no longer in the room. But the consequences were. And every board member at that table knew exactly how history would remember her arrogance, as they wrote her ultimate downfall into the company history. Her pitch was rejected. That final vote took just 22 minutes. They gave Claire the floor first, a final empty courtesy. She used 8 of those precious minutes defending a record they had already finished judging. She bragged about the launch, her client list, and the brand she spent 9 years building. But she never mentioned that crucial meeting on the 30th floor, or the hand she proudly refused to shake because of status. The board listened without interrupting once. When she finished, Daniel Carver thanked her, and the audit chair called for the vote. The tally was 9-2. Those loyal to had been handpicked during her tenure, and even now they could not bring themselves to oppose her publicly. The other 9 avoided her gaze entirely as their names were read aloud. Rebecca Stone cast the final vote, her voice calm and completely without hesitation. Claire had exactly 15 minutes to pack her things and leave the office. The legal team immediately called Patricia, dialing right outside the boardroom the second the vote was official. They gave orders to begin the standard firing procedure. A single box from the supply room was already waiting when the disgraced executive walked in. No angry words were exchanged, and absolutely no apologies were offered. Patricia held the box open while Claire reached for her things. A framed photo of herself at a 2017 business conference. She set it flat on top of some notebooks and her planner. The box was barely half full when they taped it shut. 2 guards waited outside. They escorted her to the elevator, keeping a polite, professional distance. The very lift she had taken every single morning for years. 9 years now dropped past floors where her former staff were already, whispering through texts and rumors that her power was completely gone. Before the elevator doors even reached the lobby, everyone inside knew her fate. When she stepped out onto Park Avenue, a swarm of photographers was waiting. By that evening, those humiliating photos were plastered across every major news site. A fallen executive in a navy coat clutching a sad cardboard box. Her expression was frozen, mask-like, trying desperately to hide her deep shame. She was determined not to give the press another dramatic headline. Ignoring the shouting reporters, she slipped quickly into the back of a waiting car. As the vehicle sped off, the cameras finally lowered. Her legacy was reduced to one embarrassing photo and a headline that would haunt her forever. The firm immediately lost over half of its total market value within just 3 months. Their key rollout was canceled and major clients walked away. An outside chief executive was quickly hired to save them. A humble, quiet leader known for rebuilding broken corporate cultures. He spent his first 60 days listening and the next 60 restructuring. The final 60 days were spent undoing the damage her pride had caused. The company survived, but it was forced to change completely. While the name on the door remained, the toxic arrogance was gone. Claire vanished from public view for 90 days, ruined by her own ego. She abandoned her luxury Upper East Side high-rise, stripped of her pride. Hiding in a cramped uptown flat, desperate for a street where nobody knew her face. No more meetings, no more power. She ignored the buzzing phone, shutting out the few associates who still bothered to ring. After 2 weeks of brutal news coverage, she stopped reading, realizing there's a point where public shame teaches you nothing. Reading about your own downfall eventually stops offering any useful lessons. For 90 days she stared blankly out of a window, trapped in her own mind, watching a single lonely tree in the courtyard. Her thoughts constantly drifted back to that fateful morning on the 30th floor, replaying her ultimate mistake. She thought constantly about the outstretched hand she dismissed. She pictured the 11 board members looking away in silence when she tried to defend her career. At first, her ego tried to rewrite history. She convinced herself that the board had maliciously betrayed her, ruined by the press and her colleagues, betrayed by a man who dared to enter her boardroom wearing an inexpensive, worn-out suit, someone who refused to play by her elitist rules of status and title. By the second month's end, the illusion faded. She couldn't play the victim anymore because her excuses sounded incredibly hollow, even when spoken in an empty room. The reality was far simpler and much more painful to accept. She had built her entire reputation on the arrogant belief that she could judge a person instantly. She was incredibly proud of that shallow gift. She had passed down this elitist judgment to younger executives, labeling it as true corporate wisdom. Losing everything brings a painful clarity. Now she finally understood what she had done. She had never actually been reading people. She had been completely blind to their character. She was only reading their clothes, measuring human worth by their expensive watches, designer shoes, and tailored jackets. Her arrogance had confused wealth with wisdom for so long, she forgot that real value lies beneath the surface. Her financial empire was never the main issue here, nor was the cutthroat corporate rivalry the real lesson. The tragedy of her story boiled down to one arrogant decision made in under 3 seconds. A choice to treat another human like garbage. Deciding that a man in a cheap suit didn't deserve a simple handshake. The chaotic 2 weeks that followed were just the natural fallout of her toxic pride. Not a punishment, just the consequence. It's a hard lesson for anyone, and she was finally learning that respect is never reserved for titles. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Hayes quietly returned to a simple daily routine that showed absolutely no signs of his massive wealth. He still drove his 5-year-old car. He drank coffee at the exact same Atlantic Avenue counter, clutching the same worn, taped-up briefcase. The local deli workers had no clue that this unassuming regular, buying his morning paper, had just completely dismantled a massive corporate empire with a single stroke. Yet behind closed doors at his firm, everything had changed. His top executive team watched him very closely. They respected a leader who always valued substance over mere show. They watched him navigate the fallout, proving that true power never needs to scream. He didn't celebrate. He didn't grant any press interviews. He turned down every invitation to discuss the Whitmore situation. When a major business writer went through 3 intermediaries just to get a single statement, Oliver replied with 4 words, "The matter is closed." Instead, he chose to open a very different door. On a Monday morning, he told Marcus he wanted to launch a brand new fund. Small for them, $100 million to start. Its mandate was incredibly narrow and highly specific. It would back small companies and solo operators who had been ignored, dismissed, and entirely underestimated by the larger, arrogant institutions in the industry. Their checklist wouldn't look like standard industry protocols. The fund wanted to invest in people, not pedigrees. Marcus took in the plan and carefully asked if this was related to the closed case. Oliver stared across his desk and simply muttered that they had nothing to do with each other. Marcus understood this immediately, in the way that long-term employees read their bosses, knowing this was as close as Oliver would get to admitting they were. Within 90 days, the fund was fully operational. They made their first 3 investments before the quarter ended. The first was a shipping firm run by a founder Claire Whitmore had 2 years. Earlier, refused to meet because she deemed his small business unworthy of her time. The second was a tech software startup, founded by a brilliant woman who was laid off from a larger firm because her official exit review claimed she didn't look polished enough to present to clients. The third was a factory in Pennsylvania run by a man who had been turned away by 4 major banks before Oliver's team returned his call within an hour. Oliver also quietly launched a mentorship program run out of one floor of his Manhattan office. They gathered twice every month. The members were young builders who had repeatedly been told in one way or another that they didn't belong in the rooms where major decisions actually got made. Oliver sat in on every single class. He barely spoke, he just listened. And when he did offer advice, it was always a profound question the room hadn't considered. Word finally slipped out that this private program existed. A brief feature ran in a trade magazine. It didn't mention Oliver's name by his own request. Frankly, it didn't need to. The founders in those seats knew exactly who had built that room. Meanwhile, inside Whitmore Dynamics, the brand new chief executive emailed Rebecca Stone privately during his 6th month on the job. She had stayed on the board during the transition. His email tactfully asked if she would consider sharing her thoughts on the record about the massive corporate scandal that had unfolded the prior year. The fresh leadership wanted to wipe the corporate slate clean. They wanted their next decade to start with real honesty. Rebecca spent 2 weeks deciding. She discussed the note several times with Daniel Carver, who had also chosen to stay on the board. Wrestling in his own quiet way with his silent compliance on the day status was valued over basic respect. They both agreed that the public apology had to come directly from her. He would quietly carry his own apology to the firm's employees who actually deserved respect. She finally accepted a speaking slot. Speaking at a business ethics panel held in the middle of Manhattan. The room was small, filled mostly with eager graduate students. She never named her colleague, but she really did not need to. She shared the story of a 30th floor boardroom where an arrogant refusal of a handshake occurred, and of 11 people, including herself, who chose status over respect and stayed silent. She offered a public, heartfelt apology directly to Oliver Hayes. He was not there, and she never expected him to show up. A video of her public confession went online within a few hours. That evening, Oliver watched it alone, sitting high above the mentorship program's floor. He chose not to respond publicly. Through Marcus, he sent Rebecca a brief private note saying only, "Thank you." She saved it. Meanwhile, he delivered another note to Daniel Carver. It was hand-delivered to his office that very same week. Daniel never shared the words that were written on that paper. He folded it once and hid it inside the cover of the legal pad he carried into the boardroom that morning. He kept that pad on his desk as a lifelong reminder of his silence. Exactly 1 year after that silent disaster on the 30th floor, a major business summit in Midtown asked Oliver to deliver their keynote address. He had rejected every offer for 20 years, but this time he accepted. The organizers did not understand why he suddenly agreed, but they did not ask questions. They plastered his name in bigger letters than they ever had for anyone else. Naturally, every single seat in the auditorium sold out within a week. He stepped onto the stage wearing a sharp charcoal suit, though a different one. At Marcus's insistence, his old suit had finally been retired the previous summer. But the style was identical, showing quiet respect, modest tailoring, and clean cuffs. Using absolutely no notes, he spoke clearly for 31 minutes. He never mentioned the arrogant company, nor did he name the executive who snubbed him. Instead, he focused on the honest businesses he had funded over the past year, and the passionate operators he had met. He celebrated the quiet, hard-working people building this country, the ones ignored by those flashy magazines he stopped reading long ago. He only spoke about real respect because the moderator explicitly asked. This happened right at the end. The host finally asked the exact question the entire crowd had been waiting for. What was the single most important factor behind his incredible lifelong success? A profound silence fell over the massive auditorium. People go silent when they expect a brilliant quote, but Oliver took his time to answer. He stared quietly down at his hands before looking back up at the silent crowd. People judge too quickly based on outward status, he said. I have spent 30 years trying desperately not to be one of those people. Some days I succeed, other days I fail, but the real work is in the trying. The crowd let that powerful truth hang in the air before erupting into applause. The applause was quiet but deep. It was the kind of deep applause that fills a room when people are finally forced to face a truth they had ignored for far too long. Oliver let the clapping fade, then quietly thanked the host. As he stepped down, Claire was nowhere near that auditorium. Instead, she streamed his speech from a tiny laptop in her modest uptown apartment. Lately, she had been trying to piece her shattered professional life back together, far below her old status. Avoided any position that would shine a spotlight on her. She quietly took a low-key role at a boutique advisory firm and agreed to mentor a couple of junior staffers at a local charity. She was still discovering who she actually was, now that her arrogant title-obsessed past had crumbled. Rebuilding her character and learning genuine humility was a debt she would be paying for the rest of her life. She never reached out to Oliver, though the urge had crossed her mind daily. She wrote 3 separate apologies, only to tear each one of them up. Deep down, she knew those letters were just to ease her own guilt. The real penance for her toxic pride could not be delivered in a neat little envelope. She owed it to every junior employee she had dismissed as utterly worthless. Every hard worker she ignored simply because they lacked a fancy title. Everyone who watched her treat people like garbage, teaching them the lie that status is the only thing that defines a person's worth. Tracking down those she wronged and offering real quiet apologies. Admitting her arrogance face to face was painful and unglamorous, far harder than making one dramatic gesture to a man who did not want it. But it was her chosen path. Because she finally realized that showing respect was all that mattered now. Meanwhile, the towering corporate offices downtown kept spinning their usual web of greed. Huge deals closed, and boardrooms filled with arrogant power brokers. Staff at the front desks kept watching the wealthy executives pass by, quietly deciding based on expensive suits and fancy watches who truly belonged there and who was entirely worthless. But their superficial judgments would inevitably blind them to reality. Usually, their prideful mistakes went entirely unnoticed. Yet every so often, on an ordinary morning when they least expect it, a seemingly ordinary person will walk in without any flashy credentials, holding the keys to a massive new business opportunity in their hands. And the countdown to a massive wake-up call would quietly begin. In this world, genuine respect holds far more weight than raw power. You must never judge someone by their appearance because an arrogant glance can cost you everything. Sometimes the most unassuming person in the room actually holds your entire future in their hands. Always.